The rain hadn't stopped for 3 straight days, turning the dark soil of Oakhaven into a thick, unyielding soup. Across the county line, sheer panic was setting in. A fleet of million-dollar, state-of-the-art tractors, machines outfitted with GPS and climate control, were buried to their axles, completely paralyzed in the mud. The corporate farm managers could only stand in the downpour, shouting into their cell phones as their multi-million-dollar seasons slipped away. Just 2 miles down the road, the scene couldn't have been more different. Arthur, a 72-year-old farmer whose hands bore the permanent scars of a lifetime of honest work, stood in his weathered barn. He wasn't looking at satellite maps or touchscreen dashboards. He was looking at a rusted, grease-stained 1940s plow blade. It was heavy, scarred, and had been sitting under a canvas tarp since the Carter administration. Only a week earlier, the younger, wealthy farmers had practically laughed him out of the Main Street diner when he mentioned pulling it out of retirement. They told him his old iron belonged in a county museum. They insisted that modern farming belonged only to the massive machines. But as Arthur turned the ignition on his vintage rig, coughing out a thick cloud of diesel smoke, he knew something they didn't. He knew the forgotten secret of the old iron. And in a matter of hours, those same men who had laughed at him would be begging for a miracle. The exhaust pipe of the old tractor rattled, spitting a halo of black soot into the grey, rain-choked sky. Arthur gripped the cold steel of the steering wheel. He didn't have a heated cab, a leather air ride seat, or a satellite screen to tell him the moisture content of the soil. He just had the chill of the November wind biting at his jaw and the heavy canvas of his waxed chaw coat keeping the worst of the weather out. This was the way he had farmed since he was a boy, riding on the fender while his father drove this exact same piece of land. He eased the clutch out. The transmission groaned, a deep mechanical grievance that only old iron makes. But then the gears caught. The tractor lurched forward out of the dry sanctuary of the barn and into the driving rain. The field before him was a nightmare. 3 days of relentless downpour had turned the usually rich, forgiving soil into a dark, treacherous bog. Over at the megafarm across the ridge, the corporate boys were learning a hard lesson about gravity and physics. Their massive, dual-wheeled behemoths, machines that weighed as much as a commercial airplane, had broken through the top crust and created a vacuum in the mud. The more horsepower they applied, the deeper they buried themselves. They were entirely reliant on brute force, and nature was winning. Arthur steered his much smaller, narrower rig toward the first row. Hanging off the back was the real gamble, the rusty 1940s moldboard plow. When he had unchained it from the back of the shed, peeling back the dry-rotted canvas tarp, it looked like a relic fit for a scrap heap. The rusted steel was pitted, and the wooden handles on the depth levers were smooth from decades of sweat and friction. In the diner a week ago, a younger farmer named Richard, a man who leased 10,000 acres and drove a pickup truck that cost more than Arthur's entire house, had pointed at Arthur across the counter. "You're living in the past, old man," Richard had said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "That old junk is going to snap in half the second it hits wet clay. You need to upgrade or get out of the way. We rely on data now, not rust." Arthur hadn't argued. He just paid for his black coffee, left a $1 tip, and walked out. He knew something Richard didn't. He knew the history of that blade. It wasn't designed by computer engineers in a clean room. It was forged by men who had survived the Dust Bowl. It was built with a specific curve, a sweeping geometry meant to slice under the heavy, wet prairie sod and roll it over, breaking the suction instead of fighting it. Arthur reached behind him, gripping the stiff, cold lever. He took a breath, the damp air filling his lungs, and dropped the blade into the earth. Instantly, the tractor bogged down. The front tires lifted an inch off the mud. The engine RPMs dropped violently, the pistons fighting against the sudden, massive resistance of the saturated clay. For a heart-stopping second, Arthur thought Richard was right. The engine shuddered, coughing out thick smoke. The mud was too heavy. The old girl was going to stall. right there in the first 10 yards. But Arthur didn't panic. He didn't force the throttle. Instead, he reached down and made a microscopic adjustment to the drafting lever, raising the blade just a fraction of an inch to change the angle of attack. He listened to the engine, really listened to it, the way you listen to the heartbeat of an old friend. The old iron found its rhythm. The engine note leveled out into a steady rhythmic thumping. Behind the tractor, a miracle of forgotten engineering began to unfold. The rusted blade cut cleanly under the muck. Because of its unique sweeping curve, it didn't just drag through the mud like modern disc harrows do. It lifted the heavy, waterlogged soil and gracefully rolled it aside. It broke the vacuum. The tractor's narrow tires gripped the hardpan beneath the slop, and slowly, steadily, Arthur began to move. He was plowing. In conditions that had completely paralyzed millions of dollars of modern technology, Arthur's rusty relic was slicing through the field like a hot knife through butter. He finished the first row, leaving a perfect overturned ribbon of dark earth in his wake. Then he turned and started the next. The rain kept falling, but Arthur kept moving. A profound sense of quiet pride settled over him. It was a victory for the old ways, a testament to the durability of things built to last. If you're the kind of person who still believes that old-fashioned hard work and wisdom can outsmart all the flashy new gadgets in the world, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. It means a lot to have folks like you around the fire. Arthur was halfway through his south acreage when he saw it. Through the grey curtain of rain, a pair of headlights was flashing erratically near his property line. He slowed the tractor, wiping the rainwater from his eyes. Stuck deep in the drainage ditch, separating his land from the main road, was a brand new, lifted pickup truck. The driver was revving the engine wildly, sending geysers of mud spinning into the air, only burying the truck deeper until the frame was resting entirely on the ground. Arthur squinted. He recognized the custom grille and the flashy paint job. It was Richard. The same man who had humiliated him at the diner was now hopelessly trapped, out in the freezing rain, trying to check on his own ruined, unplowed fields. Arthur idled his engine. He looked at his own field, perfectly turned and ready. He had his own work to finish, and time was running out before the soil temperature dropped too low. Leaving his field now to drag his rig through the deepest part of the ditch was a massive risk. If he went down there into the runoff trench, he might sink his own tractor, losing everything. He owed Richard absolutely nothing. In fact, leaving him there for the tow trucks would have been a perfectly justified serving of humble pie. Arthur gripped the steering wheel. The rain pounded against his shoulders. He looked down at the rusty blade that was currently saving his livelihood, and then he looked back out at the panicked flashing lights in the ditch. The old tractor idled, waiting for his command. Arthur sighed, the quiet sound lost in the relentless drumming of the rain against his waxed shawcoat. Back in the day, when this town was smaller and folks relied on each other to survive the harsh winters, a neighbor was simply a neighbor. You didn't leave a man stranded, no matter how much hot air he'd blown at the local diner. It was about a handshake, a person's word, and doing what was right. He reached down, gripped the cold steel lever, shifted the heavy transmission into reverse, and slowly backed his rumbling tractor toward the flooded ditch. Richard was standing knee-deep in the freezing slop, his expensive leather boots completely ruined, his face pale with a mix of shock and panic. He had thousands of acres to manage, corporate investors to answer to, and right now he couldn't even manage to get his flashy pickup truck back onto the asphalt. When he saw Arthur's old rig backing through the grey curtain of rain, he stopped waving his arms. The humiliation was written all over his face. Arthur killed the power takeoff, set the heavy iron brake, and climbed down from the saddle. He didn't say a single word about the diner. He didn't gloat. He just waded into the freezing mud, reaching into the dented metal toolbox bolted to the fender. He pulled out a thick, forged steel logging chain, the kind that weighed 40 pounds and had pulled countless stubborn oak stumps before Richard was even born. He hooked the rusted steel clevis to the truck's front tow hook, then waded back to loop the heavy chain over the tractor's iron drawbar. "You're going to tear your hitch right off, Arthur," Richard yelled over the howling wind, shaking in his soaked designer jacket. "That relic doesn't have the weight to pull me out of this suction." Arthur just looked at him from under the dripping brim of his cap. "Get in your truck," he said, his voice calm, steady, and cutting right through the storm. "Put it in neutral. Don't touch the gas. Let the old iron do the heavy lifting." Arthur climbed back up and gripped the wheel. He throttled up, and the diesel engine let out a deep, chest-rattling roar. The narrow, heavily lugged tires spun for just a fraction of a second before biting fiercely through the slop, finding the solid clay hardpan underneath. The chain snapped taut, springing violently off the mud. The old tractor groaned, the front end getting dangerously light, hovering just inches off the ground. For a tense, breathless moment, nothing happened. It was a brutal tug-of-war between a century of old-school American steel and the unforgiving gravity of the flooded ditch. Then, with a loud sucking sound, the heavy mud yielded. The massive pickup truck lurched forward, inching up the embankment. Arthur didn't let off the throttle until he had pulled Richard completely safely onto the solid gravel shoulder of the county road. Richard stepped out of the truck, his legs visibly shaking. But he didn't look at his muddy, damaged vehicle. He looked past Arthur's tractor, staring out across the fence line. There, in the fading grey light of the storm, he saw Arthur's south acreage. While his own corporate megafarm was a chaotic swamp of sunken million-dollar equipment, Arthur's field was beautifully, perfectly plowed. The dark, rich soil was turned in neat, even ribbons, ready for planting. The old 1940s blade hadn't just survived, it had thrived where modern engineering had completely failed. If you're the kind of person who knows that a good deed is never wasted, and that sometimes the oldest ways are still the best ways, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It means the world to have folks like you keeping these stories alive. Richard walked over to the idling tractor. The arrogance that had filled him at the diner was entirely gone, washed away by the freezing rain and a heavy dose of reality. "Arthur," he started, his voice cracking, barely above a whisper. "My fields are drowning. My GPS rigs are buried up to the axles. If I don't turn that soil by Monday, I lose the winter wheat contract. I lose the whole season." He swallowed hard, looking at the rusty moldboard plow hanging off the back of Arthur's tractor. Could that thing pull through the lower bottomland? Arthur looked out toward the massive corporate property. "She's pulled through worse. During the flood of '73, my dad used this exact same blade to save the whole township's corn crop." "I'll pay you," Richard pleaded. "Whatever your day rate is, I'll triple it. I just need a miracle." Arthur shook his head. "I don't need your money, son, but I'll help you out. That's just what neighbors do." For the next 48 hours, the old iron didn't stop running. While the million-dollar behemoths sat hopelessly paralyzed in the muck like sunken ships, Arthur's modest 1940s rig chugged tirelessly across Richard's bottomland. The sweeping curve of the antique blade sliced perfectly under the heavy, saturated soil, rolling it over and breaking the vacuum. Arthur worked through the night, guided only by the dim yellow glow of his halogen headlights. By Sunday morning, the rain finally broke, giving way to a pale golden sunrise, and Richard's most critical acreage was entirely plowed. The season was saved, not by satellite data or massive horsepower, but by a rusty piece of scrap metal and a 72-year-old man who understood the rhythm of the earth. The following Tuesday, the morning sun was shining bright, drying out the muddy streets of Oakhaven. The bells on the door of the Main Street diner jingled as Arthur walked in, taking off his cap and hanging his waxed coat on the brass hook by the door. The diner was packed with local farmers, all of them nursing cups of black coffee and talking quietly about the storm's aftermath. As Arthur walked toward his usual stool at the counter, the room went entirely quiet. In the corner booth, Richard stood up. He didn't have his usual swagger. He walked over, extending a clean, firm hand. "Morning, Arthur," he said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Your breakfast is already paid for, and so is your coffee for the rest of the year as far as I'm concerned." Arthur smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that reached his tired eyes. He shook Richard's hand, a firm, honest grip. "Appreciate it, Richard. Good to see you on solid ground." Sometimes the world moves so fast that we forget the value of things built to last. We throw away the old to make room for the new, thinking that shinier is always better. But every now and then, when the storm hits and the mud gets deep, it's the old iron, the calloused hands, and the quiet wisdom of a lifetime of hard work that end up saving the day.